What happens when a moment meant to be light television suddenly turns into a silence, so heavy that even the studio lights seem to flicker with tension? The morning audience inside the studio of The View had arrived expecting the usual rhythm: sharp political debates, laughter, quick jokes tossed between hosts, and the occasional celebrity promoting a film. It was supposed to be another ordinary broadcast. Cameras glided smoothly across the set. Producers whispered through headsets behind the glass control room. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. But nobody inside that studio, not the producers, not the hosts, not the viewers watching from home, was ready for the moment that would unfold between Gal Gadot and Joy Behar. And before we dive into this unbelievable moment, make sure you hit subscribe to Live Narratives, tap the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because the story you're about to hear is one of those television moments people still talk about long after the cameras stop rolling. The applause sign lit up. The audience clapped as the hosts of The View walked out one by one, smiling, waving, greeting familiar faces in the crowd. At the center of the table sat Joy Behar, her expression bright and confident, perfectly comfortable in the controlled chaos of live television. She had been here countless times before. Debate, controversy, awkward exchanges. None of it was new to her. But that morning, something felt different. A few seats away, the other hosts shuffled their cue cards as the show began. Coffee mugs clinked softly against the glass table. The cameras moved in close as the segment introduction started. Today, one of the hosts announced, "We're welcoming a global superstar." The audience erupted again, because the guest walking out was none other than Gal Gadot, the actress who had become a worldwide icon after portraying Wonder Woman. Her presence always carried a calm confidence, the kind that filled a room without effort. When she stepped onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet almost instantly. Gal smiled warmly, waving as she approached the table. She looked poised, elegant, relaxed. A woman who had spent years navigating red carpets, interviews, and the pressure of global fame. Joy Behar leaned forward slightly, studying her. Not aggressively, not yet, but carefully. Gal sat down, smoothing her dress slightly as the applause faded. One of the hosts started with friendly questions: her new project, filming experiences, funny stories from the set. The conversation flowed easily at first. Gal laughed when describing long training days for action scenes. The audience laughed too. Joy smiled politely, occasionally nodding. For several minutes, everything felt exactly as it should on a daytime talk show. But television has a strange rhythm. Sometimes the tone changes in an instant. It happened when Joy Behar tilted her head slightly and spoke again, her voice carrying that familiar edge viewers had come to recognize. "So, Gal," Joy said, casually folding her hands together, "you're known for playing heroes, strong women who stand for something." Gal nodded politely. "Yes," she said softly. Joy leaned back. But Joy continued, her tone shifting just a little. "Real life can be more complicated than the movies, can it?" The audience grew quieter. It wasn't unusual for the hosts of The View to ask difficult questions. The show thrived on it. Still, something about the way Joy phrased it made a few people in the audience glance at each other. Gal remained calm. She had faced tough questions before. "Yes," Gal said. "Life is definitely more complicated." Joy gave a small smile. "But do you ever feel," she asked slowly, "that Hollywood sometimes celebrates certain voices while ignoring others?" The table shifted slightly. One of the other hosts glanced down at her cue cards. Another host raised her eyebrows just a bit, because the questions suddenly felt less like a promotional interview and more like the beginning of a debate. Gal paused. Only for a moment. But on live television, even a second can stretch into something enormous. She looked at Joy with a polite expression. "I think Hollywood is a big place," Gal said carefully. "There are many voices." Joy nodded slowly, tapping her fingers on the table. "But not all voices are equally welcomed, right?" Now the tension became visible. The audience, which had been laughing moments earlier, sat completely still. Producers behind the cameras exchanged glances. This wasn't in the usual rhythm of the segment. Gal straightened slightly in her chair. She still smiled, but now it looked more thoughtful than relaxed. I think everyone deserves to be heard, she replied calmly. Joy's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. And when those voices come with complicated political backgrounds? Joy asked. A murmur rippled through the audience. Now everyone understood where this conversation was heading. The air in the studio seemed to thicken. Gal didn't immediately answer. For the first time since she walked on stage, her expression shifted from casual warmth to something more serious. But she remained composed. I believe, Gal said slowly, choosing every word with care, that conversations should bring people together, not divide them. One of the hosts quickly jumped in with a nervous laugh. Well, that's definitely a diplomatic answer. The audience chuckled lightly. But Joy Behar didn't laugh. She leaned forward again, eyes focused directly on Gal. And what if those conversations involved difficult truths? The silence that followed was almost startling, because now it wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a confrontation forming in real time. Gal looked directly back at Joy. Her voice remained calm, but there was something different in her tone now. Confidence. Resolve. Difficult truths, Gal said, should always be discussed with respect. The audience applauded softly, but Joy's expression didn't change. She tilted her head again. And do you think Hollywood always shows that respect? For a split second, nobody spoke. Not the hosts. Not the audience. Not even the producers whispering through headsets. Because the conversation had crossed an invisible line. And the moment that followed would leave the entire studio staring. Partly in shock. Partly in disbelief. And partly because nobody expected Gal Gadot's next words. The silence that followed Joy's question seemed to stretch across the studio like a tight wire. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The audience sat frozen, their earlier excitement replaced with curiosity and unease. Cameras quietly adjusted their angles, zooming closer to the faces around the table. In the control room, producers leaned forward toward their monitors. Because something had shifted. This was no longer a routine celebrity interview on The View. This had become something far more unpredictable. Gal Gadot held Joy Behar's gaze for a moment longer than most guests ever would. Not in a confrontational way, but in a way that made it clear she wasn't going to dodge the conversation either. She inhaled slowly. I think respect, Gal said carefully, depends on whether people are willing to listen. The room remained still. Across the table, Joy Behar raised one eyebrow slightly, clearly intrigued by the response. That sounds nice, Joy replied, her voice calm but unmistakably sharp. But listening usually means hearing things we don't like. A few audience members shifted in their seats. One of the co-hosts forced a polite smile, glancing briefly toward the producers behind the cameras, as if silently asking whether the conversation should move on. But Joy wasn't finished. And sometimes, she continued, tapping a finger lightly on the table, people say things publicly that spark strong reactions. Especially celebrities. Gal nodded slowly. That's true. Joy leaned forward again. You've spoken publicly about issues before, she said. Some people admire that. Others, well, they don't. A faint murmur moved through the audience again. The tension was subtle, but undeniable. Gal remained composed, her posture relaxed, her hands resting gently on the table. When you're in the public eye, she said, you know people will have different opinions. Joy tilted her head slightly. But do you think celebrities should speak about politics at all? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Because it wasn't just about Gal anymore. It was about every actor, every singer, every public figure who had ever used their platform to say something bigger than promoting a movie. Gal considered the question. Well, she said slowly, celebrities are people first. We all have beliefs. Joy nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't completely satisfied. Sure, she said. But some viewers might wonder why actors think their opinions carry more weight than anyone else's. A couple of audience members chuckled quietly. The atmosphere had turned into something halfway between debate and performance. Gal smiled slightly. I don't think anyone's opinion carries more weight, she replied. But when you have a platform, you also have responsibility. Joy crossed her arms lightly. Responsibility to say what? Gal paused. The question sounded simple, but the way Joy asked it made it feel loaded. To say what you believe, Gal answered. Joy leaned back in her chair again, studying her guest carefully. And if what you believe makes people angry? Another pause. The camera cut briefly to the audience, faces focused, eyes wide, waiting for the next moment. Gal looked thoughtful. Then maybe, she said quietly, that means the conversation matters. A small wave of applause rippled through the studio, but Joy's expression remained steady. And what about accountability? She asked, because public figures sometimes say things that create backlash. Now one of the other hosts finally stepped in, trying to lighten the mood. Well, backlash is practically the internet's favorite hobby these days, she joked. The audience laughed. For a moment, the tension loosened. But Joy turned back toward Gal again. Let's talk about that, she said. The laughter faded. Gal tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Joy folded her hands again. Social media, she said. Public reactions. Controversy. You've experienced that too. Now everyone in the room was listening carefully, because Joy had slowly guided the conversation into territory that was no longer abstract. It was personal. Gal's smile softened, but her expression remained calm. Yes, she said. Anyone who speaks publicly eventually experiences criticism. Joy nodded. And how do you handle that? The question seemed almost friendly, but the way Joy held Gal's gaze made it clear she was waiting for something deeper. Gal leaned slightly forward. I remind myself that behind every opinion is a person, she said. Joy gave a small, skeptical smile. That's a very generous way of looking at it. Gal shrugged lightly. It helps. Joy tapped her fingers again. But do you ever feel misunderstood? Now the studio felt even quieter than before. Gal didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly at the audience. Hundreds of faces stared back at her. Then she turned back toward Joy. Yes, she said honestly. Joy nodded once. That must be frustrating. It can be, Gal admitted. Joy leaned closer across the table. So, what do you do when someone publicly challenges your views? The question hung in the air. One of the co-hosts shifted uncomfortably. Another host looked down at her cue cards again, because now the conversation felt like it was building toward something bigger. Gal's voice remained steady. I listen, she said. Joy smiled faintly. And if you disagree? Gal met her eyes again. Then I explain my perspective. Joy's smile widened just a little. And what if the other person refuses to listen? Gal didn't hesitate this time. Then the audience decides for themselves. That line drew a louder reaction from the crowd. Some clapped. Others exchanged impressed looks. Joy Behar, however, remained very still. For a moment she said nothing. Then she let out a soft laugh. Well, she said, that sounds like exactly what's happening right now. The audience laughed nervously, because suddenly the entire room understood something. This conversation wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was happening. Live. And neither woman was backing away. Joy leaned back in her chair again, folding her arms. Let's be honest, she said. You're known for being diplomatic. Gal smiled slightly. I try. But diplomacy, Joy added, can sometimes look like avoiding the real issue. A few gasps could be heard in the audience. One of the hosts quickly jumped in again. Joy, you're really keeping this interview exciting today. But Joy didn't take her eyes off Gal, because she was waiting to see if the actress sitting across from her would finally push back. Gal sat quietly for a moment. Then, slowly, she spoke again. Her voice was still calm. But this time, there was something unmistakably firm in it. I don't avoid issues, she said. The room went silent again. Joy tilted her head. Oh. Gal nodded gently. I just believe the way we talk about them matters. The audience erupted into applause. Joy smiled, but the expression on her face suggested the conversation was far from over. And in the control room, one producer whispered something into a headset. Because what was happening on live television was no longer just an interview. It was becoming the kind of moment that people replay online. The kind that spreads across headlines. The kind where one sentence, one reaction can change the entire tone of the show. And the next question Joy Behar asked would push the conversation somewhere no one in the studio expected. The applause from the audience slowly faded, but the energy inside the studio had completely changed. What had begun as a friendly interview had now turned into something sharper, something unpredictable. Across the table, Joy Behar watched Gal Gadot with a thoughtful expression, as if deciding how far she wanted to push the conversation. The cameras moved closer. One focused on Gal's calm face. Another framed Joy leaning slightly forward. In the control room behind the glass wall, producers exchanged uneasy looks. One of them whispered, "Stay on this camera, don't cut away." Because whatever was happening right now on The View had become the most intense moment of the broadcast. Joy tapped her fingers lightly against the table again. "You said something interesting," she began, her tone measured but pointed. "You believe the way we talk about issues matters." Gal nodded. "Yes." Joy leaned back in her chair. "But sometimes people feel celebrities are insulated, protected by fame, protected by publicists." A few audience members shifted in their seats. The other hosts were watching carefully now. Joy continued. "So, when celebrities talk about serious global issues, some viewers wonder, do they really understand the impact of what they're saying?" The tension in the room thickened again. Gal's expression remained composed, but this time she didn't smile. She folded her hands together on the table and answered slowly. "I think people understand their own experiences," she said. Joy raised an eyebrow. "But do celebrities understand everyone else's?" Gal paused for a moment. "I don't think anyone fully understands everyone else," she replied. "But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." The audience responded with a small burst of applause. Joy nodded slightly. "That's fair." For a brief second, it looked like the conversation might settle. But then Joy leaned forward again. "And sometimes," she added, "when people try to explain their views publicly, they get criticized, sometimes heavily." Gal gave a quiet laugh. "That's the internet." The audience chuckled. But Joy didn't laugh. She looked directly at Gal again. "I'm not talking about random comments online," she said. "I'm talking about the kind of backlash that makes headlines." Now the tension snapped back into place. One of the hosts quickly picked up her mug, pretending to sip coffee while watching the exchange over the rim. Because everyone at the table knew exactly what Joy was doing. She was slowly cornering the conversation towards something more direct. Gal noticed it too. Her eyes remained calm, but the relaxed tone from earlier had disappeared. Joy continued. "Public statements," she said. "Political statements. Social statements." Gal nodded slightly. "Yes." Joy folded her hands again. "Do you think actors should be prepared for the consequences when they speak out?" Gal answered without hesitation. "Of course." Joy tilted her head. "Even if it damages their career?" The audience reacted with soft murmurs. Gal looked thoughtful. "If someone truly believes in what they're saying," she replied, "then the risk is part of the decision." Joy's eyes narrowed slightly. "So, you'd risk your career for your beliefs?" Gal shrugged gently. "I think everyone should be willing to stand behind what they say." The audience applauded louder this time. But Joy leaned forward again, her voice quieter now, almost curious. "Even if those beliefs are unpopular?" Gal looked straight at her. "Yes." That one word landed heavily in the studio. Joy studied her for a moment. Then she gave a small smile. "You're very confident about that." Gal smiled back slightly. "Confidence helps." The audience laughed softly. For a moment, the tension loosened again. But Joy wasn't done. She turned slightly toward the audience before looking back at Gal. "Let me ask you something more personal," she said. Gal's posture straightened just a little. "Okay." Joy paused for dramatic effect. "When people criticize you online, does it ever get under your skin?" The question sounded lighter than the others, but the room was still silent. Gal considered it carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. Joy nodded. "That's honest." "But," Gal continued, "I try not to let it define me." The audience applauded again. Joy tapped her finger on the table. "And when criticism comes from people in media?" she asked. Now the other hosts visibly tensed. One of them laughed nervously. "Well, we're definitely media," she joked. The audience laughed. But Joy kept her focus on Gal. Do those criticisms feel different? Gal took a breath. Then she answered calmly. I think everyone is entitled to their opinion. Joy nodded slowly. But some opinions are louder than others. Gal smiled faintly. That's true. Joy leaned forward slightly again. And sometimes, she said, those loud opinions can shape how the public sees someone. The tension in the room rose again. Gal met her gaze. Yes, she said. That's why words matter. Joy's eyebrows lifted. So, when a television host challenges you, that matters too? Now the audience reacted with audible gasps. The other hosts looked stunned, because Joy had just turned the conversation directly toward herself. Gal blinked once, clearly surprised, but she recovered instantly. She leaned slightly closer to the table. Her voice remained calm, but there was a firmness in it now that hadn't been there before. Challenges are good, Gal said. Joy smiled. Oh. Gal nodded. Yes. Because challenges create conversations. Joy folded her arms. And conversations sometimes lead to conflict. Gal didn't look away. Only if people stop listening. The audience burst into applause again. But this time the reaction was louder. Longer. Some people even stood briefly before sitting back down. Joy watched the reaction carefully. Then she turned back toward Gal, her expression thoughtful. You know, she said slowly, you're very good at this. Gal laughed quietly. At what? Joy smiled slightly. Answering difficult questions. Gal shrugged lightly. I try to answer honestly. Joy leaned closer again. But what if honesty leads to disagreement? Gal didn't hesitate. Then we disagree. The audience reacted again, clearly impressed. But Joy remained still, because she had finally reached the moment she'd been building toward. She leaned forward one last time. And what happens, she asked quietly, when the disagreement is right here at this table? The studio fell completely silent. Even the audience stopped moving. Because now the tension wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. Live. Between two people sitting only a few feet apart. Gal looked directly into Joy's eyes. And the way she straightened in her chair made it clear something had shifted. Because whatever came next would be the moment everyone remembered. The bright studio lights dimmed slightly as the show cut to a commercial break, but the tension that had built inside the studio of The View didn't disappear with the cameras turning away. If anything, it grew stronger. The moment the off-air signal flashed, the energy at the table shifted. Crew members moved quickly across the floor, adjusting microphones and whispering instructions. Producers behind the glass control room spoke rapidly into headsets. But at the center of it all, sitting just a few feet apart, were Gal Gadot and Joy Behar. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The audience, who had just watched an intense exchange unfold, buzzed quietly among themselves. Some leaned toward each other, whispering, "Did that just happen? Are they arguing?" Others pulled out their phones, already typing messages to friends watching at home. At the table, one of the co-hosts exhaled with a nervous laugh. Well, that was lively. Another host adjusted her papers, smiling cautiously. Joy Behar leaned back in her chair, taking a sip from her mug as if the previous segment had been just another normal discussion. Gal Gadot sat calmly, her hands folded loosely in front of her. For a second, their eyes met again. This time, there was no audience applause, no camera zoom, no dramatic music. Just two people acknowledging the intensity of what had just happened. Joy gave a small grin. "You handled yourself well," she said casually. Gal smiled politely. "Thank you." Joy shrugged slightly. "You know this show," she added. "We ask questions." Gal nodded. "I expected that." One of the producers walked closer to the table, giving the hosts a quick update. 2 minutes until we're back." The co-hosts straightened up immediately, preparing for the live broadcast to resume. But something interesting had changed in the air. The earlier tension wasn't gone, but it had transformed. Now it felt more like mutual respect between two strong personalities who had tested each other in front of millions. Still, the audience was watching carefully. Because even though the show was technically on break, everyone in the room knew that the next segment would determine how the entire moment would be remembered. Across the table, Joy leaned forward slightly again. "Let me ask you something honestly," she said quietly. Gal looked up.
Sure.
Joy tapped the table with one finger. "Did you think I was being too hard on you?" The question caught the nearby hosts off guard. One of them raised her eyebrows, clearly curious about the answer. Gal thought for a moment. Then she shook her head gently.
No.
Joy looked surprised. "No." Gal smiled. "I think you were doing your job." The response made Joy laugh. "Well, that's one way to look at it." Gal shrugged playfully. "I've done a lot of interviews." The audience nearby chuckled softly. Joy nodded. "Fair enough." Then she said something that surprised everyone at the table. "You know, not every guest stays that calm." Gal laughed lightly. "Maybe it's the training." "Wonder Woman training?" One of the hosts joked. The audience laughed. Gal grinned. "Something like that." The moment felt lighter now, almost friendly. But just as the tension seemed to fade completely, a producer raised a hand. 30 seconds. The audience quickly quieted down again. The co-hosts adjusted their posture. Joy placed her mug back on the table. Gal sat upright. The cameras slid smoothly back into position. The bright red on-air light blinked on again. And instantly, the energy shifted back into live television mode. The applause sign flashed. The audience clapped enthusiastically as the show returned from break. Joy smiled toward the camera. "Welcome back to The View. We're here with the incredible Gal Gadot." The audience cheered again. But viewers watching from home could sense something different now. The earlier tension had left its mark. Joy turned toward Gal again, but this time her tone was noticeably warmer. "You know," she said, "during the break, we were talking about how intense conversations can get on live television." The audience laughed knowingly. Gal smiled. "Yes, I noticed." Joy chuckled. "But honestly, those are often the most interesting moments." Gal nodded. "I agree." Joy leaned slightly forward. "And I appreciate guests who are willing to engage." Gal looked at her. "I believe conversations are important, even when they're uncomfortable." The audience applauded again. Joy smiled. "Well, you definitely proved that today." Another host jumped in. "And the internet is probably exploding right now." The crowd laughed loudly. Gal raised an eyebrow playfully. "That fast?" Joy nodded. "Oh, trust me." Everyone laughed again. But behind the humor, everyone in the studio knew the truth. Clips from this interview were already spreading online.
Short videos. Quotes.
Reactions. Because moments like this, unscripted, tense, authentic, were exactly what audiences love to watch. Joy looked toward the audience again. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "television works best when people can disagree without yelling at each other." Gal nodded. "I think so too." Joy smiled. "So maybe we just demonstrated that." The audience applauded warmly. But even as the segment wrapped up, the energy in the room suggested something bigger had happened. Something that would travel far beyond the studio walls. Because once the cameras stopped again, the real reaction would begin. Online. Across headlines. Across millions of viewers replaying the moment when a calm actress and a sharp-tongued host turned a simple interview into one of the most talked-about conversations the show had seen in years. And by the end of the day, that moment would spark a wave of reactions no one in that studio could fully predict. The show wrapped up only a few minutes later, but the energy inside the studio of The View didn't fade when the closing music began to play. If anything, it intensified. The audience rose from their seats, applauding as the camera slowly pulled back and the hosts waved goodbye to viewers at home. What looked like a normal television ending carried a strange undercurrent. Everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something unusual. Not a shouting match.
Not a meltdown.
Something rarer. A moment of real tension handled with surprising calm. At the center of it all were Gal Gadot and Joy Behar. As soon as the broadcast officially ended, the studio shifted into its familiar post-show rhythm. Crew members stepped onto the floor. Microphones were removed. Producers gathered their notes. But the audience didn't rush out immediately. Many lingered. Some pointed toward the table where the conversation had taken place. Others were already scrolling through their phones. Because the moment had already begun spreading online. One woman in the crowd turned to her friend and whispered, Look, it's already on Twitter. Her friend leaned closer. Seriously? Yeah, people are clipping it. And she was right. Across social media, short clips from the interview were appearing faster than anyone inside the studio could imagine. One clip showed Joy leaning forward with that now famous question. Another clip captured Gal's calm response. Challenges create conversations. Within minutes, viewers were reacting. Some praised Gal Gadot for staying composed. Others applauded Joy Behar for asking direct questions. Comment sections exploded with debate. Gal handled that perfectly. Joy asked what everyone was thinking. That was the most intense moment on The View in years. Back inside the studio, Gal stood up from her chair and shook hands with the hosts. The earlier tension had faded into something more reflective. One of the co-hosts smiled warmly. That was memorable. Gal laughed softly. That's one way to describe it. Joy Behar stood up as well, adjusting her glasses. For a second, the two women faced each other again. The audience nearby watched carefully, curious to see if there was any lingering friction. Instead, Joy extended her hand. "Thanks for being a good sport," she said. Gal shook it. "Thanks for asking honest questions." The brief exchange drew quiet applause from a few audience members who were still watching. Because in an era where televised debates often turned into chaos, the moment between them felt strangely refreshing. Two people had disagreed. They had challenged each other. And somehow, they had done it without losing control of the conversation. As Gal prepared to leave the set, a producer approached with a phone in hand. "You might want to see this," she said. Gal looked at the screen. Clips from the interview were already everywhere. Thousands of comments. Millions of views climbing rapidly. One headline read, "Gal Gadot stays calm during intense exchange on The View." Another headline took a different angle. "Joy Behar challenges Gal Gadot in viral talk show moment." Gal smiled slightly. "Well," she said, heading the phone back, "I guess the conversation continues." Meanwhile, Joy sat back down at the table briefly, glancing at the same growing wave of reactions. One of the producers laughed. "You two just broke the internet for the day." Joy smirked. "That happens sometimes."
But even she seemed thoughtful now.
Because moments like this, unscripted, authentic, unpredictable, were exactly what kept television alive. As Gal finally walked toward the exit, a few audience members called out to her. "You handle that great. Loved your answers." She waved politely, thanking them as she left the stage. Behind her, the studio slowly emptied. The bright lights dimmed. The once buzzing set returned to quiet. But online, the moment was just beginning its second life. Clips replayed again and again. Viewers debated every sentence. Some people sided with Joy. Others sided with Gal. And many simply admired the fact that two strong personalities had created a conversation people couldn't stop talking about. By evening, the moment had become one of the most discussed segments connected to The View that week. Not because of shouting, not because of scandal, but because tension, honesty, and calm composure had collided in front of millions of viewers. And sometimes, that's even more powerful. But now we want to hear from you. What did you think about this moment between Gal Gadot and Joy Behar? Do you think Joy was right to push the conversation further? Or do you think Gal handled the pressure perfectly? Tell us your opinion in the comments below, because your perspective is part of the conversation too. And if you enjoy dramatic stories like this, full of real tension, powerful personalities, and unforgettable moments, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives, like the video, and share it with someone who loves behind-the-scenes celebrity stories. Because the next story might be even more explosive.